The very first time I ever went hiking, it was a magical experience. I was 17 at the time, slightly overweight, and curious. Up until this point, I'd never really gone into the woods except for a few times as a kid. I was a part of a group of 5 others, a couple of my friends, and a retired pastor we all knew. Ryan was a great guy. He'd been all over the world and had hundreds of stories about other cultures and people. He knew more than most of us probably ever will, and I really wish we saw each other more often. We drove for 3 hours into the middle of West Virginia, to the house of one of Ryan's friends. The friend lived up a mountain about a mile and owned a large swatch of land where a set of old train tracks cut through the terrain. We parked about halfway up the gravel drive, at the spot where the train tracks ran along the path. We started walking along the tracks, a 5-mile journey to our ultimate destination, Spruce. The town of Spruce was erected around the 1900s, when a railroad and a way station was built for bringing goods through the mountains. Once the trains stopped running through, the town slowly died, and the last person vacated in 1950-something. All that's left now is concrete stone foundations of buildings. We arrived after about an hour and a half walking through along the road. As overweight as I was at the time, I was exhausted and pretty much set up my tent and hibernated through the rest of the day, while everybody else stayed up late into the night and told stories around the campfire. Over the next few days, we started hiking all around the little town. The day that I remember most, however, is the day that we went up the river looking to establish a more permanent campsite for our future use. We started off as the sun creased the mountains. The first half-mile or so was a typical dead and leafless trees of early spring, standing along the marshy banks of a large stream that ran through the ghost town. Then we came out suddenly into a rush oasis of trees and moss and life. The contrast was unreal compared to the rest of the area. Imagine something out of Narnia or Lord of the Rings. The stream, now more like a narrow river, flowed throughout brown and gray rocks. The banks were now dry and made out of stone, which led upstream and formed a sort of natural canal. On either side of us, the mountain went up steeply. The most striking thing, however, were the trees. Brilliant green and lush fir trees lined the banks, occasionally broken up by little clearings of tall grass. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Now, several years later, and into my early 20s, that memory is what drew me back to the place. The image of untouched section of forest, standing in all its glory without intervention of man. There was another reason, though, if I'm being honest. I was having a quarter-life crisis. I was fresh out of college and unable to produce a job. I've been mooching off my parents for nearly 6 months, and I decided to get away and try to figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. I asked around, but all my friends had jobs, or were married, or had something else keeping them from joining me. So I wound up going with my dog, a big doopy golden retriever named Atlas. So in the early spring, I loaded everything I needed into my car, threw Atlas in the back, and set off for the Spruce. The trip took a bit longer than I remembered, but that was probably due to the crappy GPS and my general lack of experience. I set up camp in the same spot that we had previously, surprised and pleased that the area was mostly untouched. I even found the old tent Ryan put in the skeleton of the church. I brought my own tent, though, and left that one there. Nothing strange happened that night. I woke up in the morning feeling refreshed, which I didn't expect, since I remember being unable to get a good night's rest the last time I visited. Atlas was already awake, pawing at the opening to the tent. I let him out and started breakfast, which consisted of a can of Spam and an MRE. We ate, and then I stood, prepared to start the walk upstream. I turned around to call Atlas back, and jumped when I saw a deer cross the stream, standing still and staring at the camp. Atlas was down by the bank, apparently ignorant of the deer's presence. The sun was creasing the mountain as it reflected off the water in the marshy area where the deer stood, backlighting it. It took me a second to realize that it was a buck. It had 30 points. I counted again and again. I wasn't a hunter, but I was able to grasp how impressive a 30-point buck was. The antlers on the thing swept out on either side like wings. I was awestruck. The rapture of the buck was broken when Atlas sneezed. The sound startled me and I looked down at him, still pawing around in the dirt. When I looked back up, the deer was gone. I looked around, hoping to catch another glimpse of it. The area where it stood was where the majority of the town had once stood, so it was still more or less a little flat plain with the only occasional tree. My search was ultimately in vain. I couldn't see so much as a swaying branch to mark its passage. Somewhat disappointed, I called Atlas and began walking along the stream. I remember the terrain almost perfectly, occasionally needing to carry Atlas over a group of nettles or large rocks that I didn't trust him not to get stuck in. He was having the time of his life. Soon we breached the thick overgrown cluster of dead trees and scrub that marked the barrier between the dead trees and the miniature oasis of life. I hefted Atlas over a log, through a tight section of trees, and then we were in. It was as beautiful as I remembered it, tall grass, rocks, and all. I sat down on a rock and soaked in my surroundings for a while, basking in nature. We ran quite a ways upstream, and with each step, the trees and grass seemed to grow thicker. We stopped and I ate a little granola bar I brought along. While I was snacking, Atlas frolicked back and forth in the water, chasing the occasional trot. I heard something crack behind me and I turned around. The buck stood there, obscured by thick foliage, only its head poking out of the trees. Our eyes locked. A feeling of immersed dread came over me. The buck's eyes were infinite black pits, holes where eyes should have been, but weren't. Voids. It hissed. I heard rustling on the other side of the stream, cracking and crashing. My head whipped around. Something immense and dark was moving through the trees. I could see its path, but not the thing itself. The void where branches had been sheared away and bushes had been trampled. It made a noise. I can't even describe the noise it made. I felt it and heard it and saw it. Trees groaned from the force of it. The water rippled. My gut wrenched and I felt sick. Time seemed to slow and stop to that moment. It was an infinity of sound that eclipsed violence and hate and death. The world went dark and I was lying on my back, staring up at the sky as the sun sank below the mountain peaks. My mouth was thick with bile and my head felt like there had been nails buried into my skull. I felt my bones creak as I stood up and looked around. Atlas sat next to me, dead or unconscious, sprawled out on his side. I heaved and felt hot blood fill my mouth. I threw up thick clotted blood. Lumps of fleshy, concealed matter were floating in the blood, dark and veined. I was in my campsite, fire burning low. My tent was shredded and hanging from a tree, sleeping bag ripped apart and thrown into the fire. My food was ripped open and the contents were mixed into a brown paste. Something had used the paste to paint words and symbols on my bodies, on the trees, on the rocks, on Atlas's fur. My clothes were wadded in a heap under the tent. I put my clothes on and left. Atlas was alive but wouldn't wake up no matter how hard I prodded or yelled or did anything to him. I ended up just slinging him over my shoulder and walking back to the car with him on my back. He woke up halfway home, groggy and sick. He threw up in the back seat, blood in veiny dark clumps. I cleaned up the mess at the nearest gas station and laid down some plastic bags in case he threw up again. That was about a year ago, and I'm not sure why I'm posting this now. I guess as a warning? I have no idea what happened between the thing in the woods and waking up in the tent, but I have dreams about it sometimes. I don't know if it's memories or my mind filling in the gaps. I see myself dancing around a funeral pry, gratting and shaking with each step, as if I'm a puppet on strings. In the fire, I see something. I know the shape of it, but I don't know what it is. I know the effects that seeing that thing had on me. I remember forgetting it. Sometimes I get images along with the dreams. Dark masses in the trees. Things I can barely comprehend. So if you're going into the woods, don't go alone. Bring a gun. Bring a radio or a phone or something, and make sure that you don't go too deep into a place that seems too good to be true. Because I think that's where the things live. Things that we can't comprehend. Just be careful. And if you decide to go to Spruce to camp or to hike, there's a spare tent in the church ruins. tucked away in one corner behind a tree. It has some holes, and it's been there for a few years, but it's better than nothing. If you lose your tent or need a spare, you're welcome to use it, as long as you put it back.